For the first part of this assignment, we're going to talk about altitude. What is altitude? When most people think of altitude, they think of something having to do with flying or jumping or airplanes, and that is altitude. Altitude is kind of in real life, is a measurement of how far something is above sea level or off the ground. In geometry, altitude and height are closely related. They're not the same thing in the real world, though. Here's an example. If this is you standing on a mountain, this is a 5-foot tall person, that's their height. If they climb up the mountain, their altitude has changed. They've gotten higher off the ground, but their height really hasn't changed. So altitude and height are slightly different in the real world, but in geometry, they're almost the same thing. Almost. And they're both variations on how tall something is. For example, here's a pyramid in Egypt. If I wanted to measure how tall it is, I don't measure the length down the side of the pyramid. When we measure something's height, we measure it straight up and down. And in geometry, when we say straight up and down, we mean that it makes a right angle with the ground. That is altitude or height. And I gave it a measurement, said 200 feet. I have no idea how tall the pyramids really are, but we'll say 200 feet. Now, altitude versus height, when we talk about this measurement, the number, the actual measurement here, that is the height of the object. The altitude is the segment we draw to represent it. So altitude and height are almost interchangeable, where height is the number and altitude is the line or segment drawn into a picture that we use to measure. So here's a triangle. If I wanted to draw in the altitude, I'm going to draw a line from the top of it down to one of the sides so that it makes a right angle. That is the altitude of the triangle. The altitude doesn't do anything special other than draw a segment from the top of the triangle or from one vertex to the bottom or to one of the sides. It doesn't do anything special to the side. It doesn't cut this side in half. See, we got a large part and a small part. It doesn't do anything special to this angle. See, I got a big angle here and a small angle here. So it doesn't do anything special to either of those. So if this is the altitude, what happens if I take this triangle and spin it around? If we take it and spin it 90 degrees, this is still the altitude of the triangle. This is still considered an altitude. It passes, it's a segment that goes from the vertex over here, vertex, to one of the sides, and it makes a right angle there. That's what makes it an altitude. We can spin this thing a couple different ways. We can keep spinning it, and it will still be the altitude. If we rotate it like this, notice our altitude can actually be upside down. It can be sideways. It's still an altitude. And because it doesn't matter which way the triangle is drawn or spun around, we can have altitudes from any of the vertices. So I could draw an altitude from this point. Oops, there we go. From this point to this side, and as long as it goes through the point over here and then makes a right angle with the side, that's still considered an altitude. I can draw an altitude from this vertex to this side. Ooh, that's a bad drawing. Let's try that one again. I draw an altitude from this vertex to this side. It's still considered an altitude as long as it's making a right angle there and passes through one of the vertices. An altitude doesn't even have to be inside the triangle. Here, when we have an obtuse triangle, sometimes the altitude ends up outside. Here, in this case, the altitude is outside the triangle because we have an obtuse triangle. But here, our altitude, again, is outside the triangle. It's not actually in it. But as long as it goes through a vertex and makes a right angle with a side, even if you have to extend the side outside it, that's an altitude. What we are going to do, and you are going to turn in, is draw a triangle and draw its altitude. So you're going to go to geogebra.org. Make sure you select geometry. Don't pick the other apps. Pick geometry. Makes the best picture for us. And we're going to start by drawing a triangle. Now, you can draw any triangle you like. So what I've done is I selected the polygon tool and I clicked 3 spots on the triangle or on the page and made sure to end where we started so that we close our shape. Second, since we're turning this in, we're going to put our name on our paper here. So you're going to go down to on the left side to the tools, go to more, go all the way to the bottom. There's a spot for text. Select that tool, click on your screen, and you can type your name and hit OK, and your name will show up right there. And you can move it around if you put it someplace obnoxious and it's in the way, you just move it around, but put your name on it. Next, to actually draw in an altitude, we need to draw a perpendicular line that goes through one of the vertices. On my triangle, I'm going to draw a line that's perpendicular to side BC on the bottom here and passes through point A. To do that, we have to find a tool that says perpendicular line. And it's over here on the left-hand side under construct. You select perpendicular line. When you do that, you're going to click on two things. One, what line you want to make a right angle with. That's the perpendicular part. So for me, I'm going to click on segment BC, the bottom of my triangle. And now I've got this thing and it moves. So the second thing I want to do is click on the point I want it to go through. I'm going to ask it to go through point A. So now I've got a line here that stays a right angle and it always goes through A no matter how I move my triangle around. Now, we specifically said an altitude is a segment, and here we've got a line, so we're going to have to turn this line into a segment. It's not hard to do that. On the left, we're going to scroll back up to the top and select point. We're going to put a point where our altitude is going to touch this side. So I'm going to make sure I put it right on the right spot, and I'm going to click right where those two meet, and I'll get point D. Next, on the left-hand side, there's a tool under Edit that says Show or Hide Object. I'm going to select that, and I'm going to click on this line. I want it to disappear and redraw it as a segment. Now make sure not to click on any of the points. You're going to go off the triangle and click on the line, and the line changes colors, but when you turn off that tool, if I go back to the arrow, now that line is gone. And we're going to redraw that as a segment. So on the left side, go to the segment tool. I'm going to reconnect my vertex A to the point D. And just to make this clear so that we know this is the segment we're looking at, I'm going to change its color. So I selected the arrow, the move tool. I'm going to click on my altitude, and I get this little menu. And I'm going to make my altitude red. You can even make it thicker, so it's really obvious that that's what we're talking about. Next, we are going to measure our angle. So on the left side, there's a tool, a set that says measure. And now there's two that say angle. One says angle with a given size. Select the one that says angle. And we're going to measure these angles where the altitude meets the side of the triangle, and it should be a right angle. It doesn't matter whether you measure the left or right side, but if I click on point B, then D, then A, I get 90 degrees there. And if it's a little crowded, you go to the arrow tool, the move tool, and I can move that out so we can see it. And now we have our altitude. We know that it makes a right angle with one of the sides. If you move the triangle around, your altitude stays through point A, and it stays making a 90-degree angle. Okay, one more thing to do with this. We're going to label this our altitude. So if you click on the segment that represents our altitude, if you go to the letters here on the little menu that picks up, we're going to label this. It's going to give it a random name. Mine says G, but I'm going to change that to the word altitude. I'm going to type in the word altitude for its label, and then I'm going to click Show Label, and now my altitude shows up. So I can see as I move my triangle around that this is always the altitude. The last thing we're going to do is take a screenshot of the picture you've made to turn it in. So you're going to take a screenshot of your picture, make sure we can see that it's an altitude and your name. So take your screenshot, and mine's going to work a little bit differently from yours, but take your screenshot. And then there is a Google slide you have that's shared with you. And there are 5 slides, one for angle bisector, perpendicular bisector, but you got to find the correct slide, the one that says altitude. And we're going to paste our picture in there. And we're going to paste it so that we make sure we can still see that this is the altitude of a triangle.